Let's dive into 3 ways that your emotions can affect your physical and your mental health. Let's dive in. Let's start off on the positive side because we often don't give enough credit to how positive emotions can positively affect our health and wellness. We know that feelings of love and joy and gratitude actually have a positive effect on our well being. Those feelings can actually have positive effects on our hormones and other neurotransmitters. For example, it can actually upregulate something like secretory IgA, which actually helps to boost our immune system. So it makes us more resilient and less likely to get sick. Those types of feelings also help us to keep our hormones regulated so that we have hormonal balance and we're not stressing out our HPA axis, and can also help lead to states where we have a healthy balance of our neurotransmitters, so our mood often stays in a positive direction. So now on the flip side, negative emotions. Now let's start with mentally what happens. So when we have those clouds of negative emotions, especially when they start to happen chronically, so feelings of anxiety, anger, depression, frustration, overwhelm, those types of feelings really start to activate our amygdala, which is often kind of referred to as the fear center or our limbic brain, kind of a primitive part of our nervous system, but its job is to keep us safe. And so when this area starts to get activated, it's telling our body that we're not safe. And it doesn't know the difference between, a true fear response, such as being in a dangerous situation, versus something that's coming from an emotion, something that you're playing over and over in your head, worrying about your finances, worrying about relationships with family. Your brain cannot tell the difference between these. So therefore, that amygdala, that area starts to get more responsive. We actually start to make even more connections within that area. So it makes the area almost a little bit bigger. And what does this do? This actually stimulates more anxiety, more fear, more of that same response. So it's kind of that old saying of thinking those same thoughts get you more of really what you don't want. So mentally, this can drive us further into those states of anxiety, further into feelings of overwhelm, further into depression in a lot of cases. And this actually leads us to number 2, which is stimulating this area or stimulating the amygdala actually then activates what we call our HPA axis or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system. And this is the system that is responsible for how we deal with stress and then starts to push on certain hormones. And this is where we can lean into hormonal dysregulation because of these negative thoughts and feelings. Once this HPA axis gets stimulated, and especially I'm talking about when it's chronic, we start to see increases in hormones like cortisol, which can then go on to affect our glucose regulation. So we start to have issues with maybe insulin resistance. It can also then affect other hormones such as our thyroid hormones and for our sexual hormones or our things like estrogen, progesterone, and even testosterone. And of course, when this happens, we start to see other issues start to appear, right? This is where we start to see pre-diabetes sometimes appear. This is where we start to see other autoimmune conditions maybe flare up. This is maybe where we start to see us getting sick more often because that high level of cortisol in a way depresses our immune system. So we're more susceptible to all the different bugs that are floating around. This is where we can see things like hypertension start to appear because we're constantly telling our body to be on alert. Our body is preparing this response. Our blood vessels constrict and blood pressure can go up. When we do this chronically enough, we get into that loop where these types of diseases can actually start to develop. And the third thing I start to see that affects our physical and mental health is that we start to develop unhealthy coping mechanisms. When we have these chronic negative emotions, so depression, anxiety, overwhelm, fear, this is where we often see those unhealthy coping mechanisms come into play. I start to see more alcohol use or dependence on alcohol to kind of take the edge off. This is where I start to see unhealthy eating patterns develop. Sometimes we turn to food to feel a little bit better or as a coping mechanism. We are eating our emotions quite literally. This is where we start to make really bad food choices. This is where we start to crave all the sugary things, all the hyper palatable foods, all the processed foods, the things that are, generally really bad for us if we overconsume. And because of that, we often see changes in our weight and weight gain. And again, the development of things like type 2 diabetes if it goes on for long enough. This is where we also see drug use start to pop up or, again, like with the alcohol, dependence on these other substances to try to take away the pain or to take away those negative emotions. So all of this to say that it is extremely important that you acknowledge your emotional health and you take that into consideration and you're doing something to deal with these negative emotions. Again, emotions in and of themselves are not a problem. They can be if we're having positive emotions, very beneficial for our health. But if we stray too far off into the negative emotions, especially when it's chronic, that's when we start to see negative consequences, not only on our physical health, but also on our mental health. So, some of the things you can do to process these emotions, or to at least, number one, acknowledge them, are things like meditation, are things like journaling. You'll be surprised what emotions come up if you just commit to sitting down for a few minutes each day and, letting your thoughts come up, whether you're writing them down in a journal or whether they're coming up in your meditation. You'll be really surprised at how they bubble up. And once you acknowledge them and kind of step forward deeper into them and start to understand the lessons that are coming along with them, you're better able to process them. And then you will be better resilient to stress in the future. I promise it works. So along with the meditation and the journaling, something you can do physically would be, of course, exercise. Exercise is also going to help you have a release valve for some of the stress that comes along with dealing with these types of emotions. And of course, there are a lot of other treatment options out there, from traditional therapy, working with acupuncture, getting massage. All these things are very valid options. But I just want to empower you in knowing the importance of also dealing with your emotions and acknowledging them, especially when you're having a lot of negative emotions, because they can have a huge effect on your health. All right, I hope that this video was helpful. If you want to dive in a little bit deeper, then why don't you take a look at this video here? All right, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.